It's very difficult to build muscle if you have a diet that is poisoning you. Muscle building can be used to reverse chronic illness, right? But it has to be used in conjunction with your diet. The interests that sell the protein, they work in collusion with the media to program the population to train them to believe that they need to pursue protein pretty aggressively. Your training strategy will make it or break your ability to build muscle.
When I look at the top athletes, there's not a lot of them who would be high or vegan, if any really. Why is that? Hi, and welcome to this new episode of the Lightleaders. Today, I'm with Remson Noire, who's a high-raw vegan nutritionist and fitness coach with over 10 years of coaching experience. He has coached over 1,000 people to get healthier and stronger and help people with various conditions, many of them like cancer, diabetes, kidney disease, lupus, Crohn's disease, and many more. And you also look amazing. You've been building a strong muscles on a high raw vegan diet, which some people think is really hard to do. So we're actually going to talk about this. That's a topic I'm really excited about, passionate about. I recently shared a video about a 1-year journey since my 14-day water fast on this. And I think you're one of the people that's fully embodied, and you're also a nutritionist. So you really know how it works. I'm really excited to have you and to dive into this. Welcome to the show, Remson.
All right. Thank you for having me.
And for the people following, I'll put chapters down the video so you can also go to the part that interests you. And thank you for joining us. I think you'll learn so much today. Remson, quick question to start with. What are you grateful for today?
I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to do the work that I do. As you know, I work as a full-time coach, mentoring people, giving out the information that people need in order to make progress on their journey. That's pretty much what I primarily do. So I'm just grateful that I get to live on my own terms. I think that's the most important thing, right? Freedom is one of my top line values because that serves for well-being. My number one objective is to expand to well-being for the overwhelming majority of us. So, yeah, everything that I'm doing currently falls in line with my values, and I don't really have to compromise on that.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Remson, and congratulations on creating this. Let's get started with a little backstory on you and how you got to do that job of nutritionist and fitness coach on a high raw vegan diet.
Yeah, so basically, I've been coaching in some way, shape, or form throughout my entire adult life, starting at the age of 18 years old officially. Started off as a personal trainer, um, and then expanded to performance enhancement, strength and conditioning, and corrective exercise. Right? So basically, helping people to expand on and create more athleticism within themselves, create more strength, endurance, mobility, etc. And then the corrective exercise, fixing posture, rehabilitating from joint injuries and things of that nature. Right. Um, then moved into nutrition. Really, I became, or I followed a vegan lifestyle, still do, um, for ethical reasons. I didn't really do it for health reasons.
How long have you been vegan?
So, but 11 years now, right? So I either started, on the plant-based journey, either in I want to say either 2012 or early 2013, one of those. Right. Um, so yeah, basically I saw what happens to animals in animal agriculture, and I was just like, nope, I can't be associated with that. That is sadistic. So, just pivoted plant-based, pretty much abandoned like 90+% of all the food that I was eating. So I had to adapt on the fly and quickly. But being a coach, and people ask me, hey, what do I eat in order to reach my goals? Well, I can't exactly tell them to do one thing while I'm doing something else. So there was a need, an upfront need in immediate fashion to be able to have good answers, right? To be able to not only survive and thrive on a plant-based diet for myself, but be able to replicate that in other people. So I did that. So I went through the education for I want to say from 2013, 2014 till 2016. Right, 2016 is when Tribe by Noir became public, meaning it was a public service that people can actively engage and seek coaching from me. But the first 2 years before that was more private, because still testing things and making sure that I was able to reproduce consistently the type of results that people were looking for, right? So did that for 2 years with people who I was working with personally in the gym, and then expanded from there. So my methodology has mostly been the same since then. It's become more evolved, more refined as I've learned more information, and my diet has gotten more raw over time. But fruit has always been a big part of the process. It's just that now it's become the majority of it, not rather than just being a big part of it. Right. So that's pretty much where I currently am today. But, I started off in the fitness background and kind of extended more so towards uh, chronic illness reversal. And the reason why, so basically, I'm from New York City. I was coaching in Manhattan, specifically the Soho area, right, or downtown Lower Manhattan. So the demographic of people that I was working with was high income people. People who were television producers, actors, models, writers, that kind of thing, right? Sometimes athletes, to varying degrees. People who they didn't really have health conditions. They weren't necessarily working class in the conventional sense. So they had a different set of issues. They more so engaged in fitness as like a hobby and thing that they did. Right? But it wasn't like, I need to do this for my health and my survival kind of deal. But there became a point where I moved to Georgia, relocated, and found myself working with a completely different demographic of people. And these people were more blue collar people. These were more lower or middle class people. And their issues were wildly different. High blood pressure, history of strokes, heart attacks, diabetes, cancer, kidney disease, liver disease, morbid obesity. We're talking about people who have to lose 100 plus pounds. Severe limitations on a growing list of variety of different medications. These are issues you can't train yourself out of. You can't fitness your way out of these issues, right? So you eat way more than you train. And your diet is way more important to your health and your fitness is. Training and whatnot, it does have a medicinal and therapeutic effect, but it's not enough to override your diet.
Even for building muscle, you'd say?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to build muscle if you have a diet that is poisoning you, right? If you have a food poisoning diet, that reduces your ability to build muscle. So basically, if you're dealing with any kind of chronic illness, your body will deprioritize muscular growth and prioritize reducing inflammation or just keeping you alive, right? So if you're diabetic, if you have high blood pressure, kidney disease, liver disease, these things will compound and reduce your ability to drop body fat and build muscle and get stronger and things like that because your body is just battling against too many things.
Yeah, and I guess
So
also when
this
you
is where
have those
diet becomes
conditions, the muscle building becomes secondary also, right? Like it's not the most important.
right. However, muscle building can be used to reverse chronic illness, right? But it has to be used in conjunction with your diet, right? Sleep quality has to be prioritized, staying hydrated, making the right food choices, right? So basically, the rule, or one of the major rules, that anything that isn't growing is dying, right? So basically, diet is a zero sum game. Whatever you're eating is either helping to maintain your life or end it. So those are some of the principles and the rules that I follow and bake into the methodology.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing, Remson, and so many things I want to get into there. Talking about protein, how muscle growth work, about the top foods for that, about also other topics. Before we get into that, can you share in just shortly how it looks like, how you eat at the moment, your high-raw vegan diet?
Yeah, so basically, I like to eat large portions, right? So some of my staple foods are, bananas, watermelons, bananas, melons, mangoes, grapes, variety of different berries, kiwis, citrus fruits like tangerines, grapefruit, etc. Right. So eating several pounds of fruit a day, right? So upwards of a minimum of 4 pounds of fruit a day to upwards of 10, even, right? Very carbohydrate dominant diet. And then, of course, we have in nuts and seeds, which is another big part of it, right? And those also contain the majority of my dietary fats, omega-3, essential fatty acids, zinc, right? Things like that. So hemp seeds, flax seeds, chia seeds, pumpkin seed kernels, sunflower seed kernels, cashews, almonds, pistachios, right? Things like that. And then the leafy greens, right? The spring mix, the watercress, the arugula, kale, right? Things of this nature. Swiss chard, romaine lettuce. As far as cooked foods, we've got things like sweet potato and lentils primarily, chickpeas, some black beans, things like that. But I don't eat a whole lot of cooked foods. Right. I eat cooked foods maybe a couple times a week, 2, 3 times a week, and that would mainly be legumes, like lentils, right? Whole grains are phenomenal, right? When you think of whole grains, people think of things like oats, quinoa. Um, my top two mainly are kasha, which is roasted buckwheat, and then rolled oats, old fashioned rolled oats, right? So I don't cook those, right? I primarily just soak them overnight and then make like a breakfast porridge with them, right? So throw them in the blender with a variety of other things, cacao powder, maybe some maple syrup, cinnamon, sea salt, that kind of thing. Make it nice and creamy, pureed in the blender. That's a good makes for a good breakfast.
Mm,
Right? So there's a lot of different recipes and things like that that I use in my diet.
amazing. Thank you. Yeah, and yeah, I eat very similarly to you actually, and that's why I'm also really interested to have you on this and on this topic. Okay, let's get into protein. I feel like that's because you're into fitness, you look like well muscular, and a lot of people think well to get that kind of muscle you need a lot of protein, but the diet you just shared would be, I don't know, I would estimate it's like maybe 10-15% protein probably of your calories, right?
Yeah, somewhere in between there. So typically, my protein intake is more along the lines of probably like 12%, 12, 16%, somewhere around there,
Okay,
right?
so I'll ask
Depending
you,
on the day.
Remson, how do you achieve such a physique with a low intake of proteins?
Yeah, so basically, I don't know. So it depends on how you qualify a low protein diet, right? So when people talk about low protein, it depends on how they quantify it. So for example, if I'm eating 100 grams of protein a day, that's not really considered a low protein diet, right? Even though, um, you know, I'm only eating maybe 12 to 16% protein in my diet, but I eat a lot of food. So typically what I would do is I would eat, let's say, protein to carbohydrates at either a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratio. So which means if you're eating protein to carbs at a 3-to-1 ratio, that would be for every 100 grams of protein, you're eating 300 grams of carbs, or a 4-to-1 would be for every 100 grams of protein is 400 grams of carbs, right? Um, so basically, I got this fly buzzing around in here. So basically, um, if you're trying to build muscle mass, the thing that the primary driver, the most important macro in your diet, as far as the amount for building muscle mass, is going to be carbohydrates. So your average person has around 18 to 20 kilograms of skeletal muscle mass in them, right? Each kilogram of skeletal muscle mass can hold around 15 grams of glucose in the form of glycogen, right? So when you consume carbohydrates, the carbohydrates break down into glucose. That glucose gets stored inside all the cells in your body, right? So let's say you have 20 kilograms of muscle mass on your body. So if we do 20 times 15, it gives us 300 grams of carbs, right? 300 grams of glucose. So in order for you to top off your muscle mass with that stored glycogen, you would need 300 grams of glucose stored inside your muscle tissue in the form of glycogen. Okay. Now, the glucose that you eat that is shared with your brain and all of your vital organs, and there's a portion of it that also has to remain in your bloodstream as well to be available for use. So even if you were to eat 300 grams of carbs per day, that's not necessarily enough to maintain full glycogen storage inside your muscle tissue. It's important to note that your brain uses around 24 to 25% or 20 to 25% of all of the glucose that you consume in a day, right? And then, of course, your heart, your liver, all of your vital organs also use glucose, right? And then, of course, if you're walking around, even non-exercise activity also utilizes glucose. So you're burning through a tremendous amount of glucose on a daily basis. People really underestimate that. Glucose basically is what we call sugar in common language. So basically, when muscle mass or skeletal muscle tissue is filled with glucose, the size of the muscle increases, right? Now, it's also important to note that muscle stores water as well as that glucose at a 3-to-1 ratio. So for every molecule of glucose, there's 3 molecules of water inside that skeletal muscle tissue. So the water combined with the glucose stored inside the muscle tissue increases the size of the muscle, right? So if you're looking to grow the size of that muscle mass, well, there's your answer. Protein doesn't really necessarily work that way. Protein is used to build new cells, not necessarily to fill the cells you already have, right? Your body's capacity to make new muscle tissue is very limited. Even if you increase the amount of protein you eat, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to gain more muscle mass. It doesn't really work that way because you have a time constraint. So when you increase the amount of protein you consume, typically what happens is that the extra protein that you consume gets converted into glucose and used for energy anyway, right? So this process is called gluconeogenesis, right? Is where those amino acids are converted into glucose to use for energy. So your body only will utilize the amino acids it needs and then convert the rest or excrete the rest. This is very important to understand because if you spend enough years of your life trying to eat as much protein as possible, you actually stress out your liver and your kidneys. So you can drive up your cholesterol, you can drive up your liver enzymes, you can drive up the amount of urine, the amount of protein that's coming out in your urine, right? When there's a pathological level of protein being filtered out through your kidneys, this is called proteinuria. Excessive levels of nitrogen inside your urine. Nitrogen is the most base form of protein. When protein is broken down into its simplest form, it's called nitrogen. And then on top of that, this leads to escalating levels of inflammation, chronic, like oxidative stress, etc. Right? And so you can see an increase in your BUN, which is blood urine nitrogen on a blood test, right? and you can see excessive levels of creatinine, where basically creatine that is naturally forming in your body, but when you consume a lot of protein, particularly from animal products, right, this drives up creatinine, right, because the level of inflammation increases as you put more stress and work on your liver and your kidneys, et cetera, so you can develop kidney disease. The interesting part is about 90% of people with kidney disease don't realize they have kidney disease, right? So people will mess up their liver and their kidneys and cause themselves to even be either insulin resistant, pre-diabetic, or just full-blown type 2 diabetic as a result of all of this excess protein consumption, right? Also, the more protein you consume, that reduces the amount of carbohydrates you consume and increases the amount of dietary fat you consume, right? Um, and a lot of times when people pursue this, especially through animal products, what happens is they get an increase in saturated fat and protein, and those two together create insulin resistance. So this keeps your blood sugar excessively high. And what happens is when you're insulin resistant, this raises the amount of insulin that your pancreas secretes in order to shuttle that glucose in your bloodstream into your muscle tissue and all your vital organs. But when you're insulin resistant, that insulin doesn't do as good of a job of shuttling that glucose into those cells. So you get like this starvation of your muscle tissue, a starvation of your brain and all your vital organs. Your blood pressure goes up, and then you poor sleep quality, mental health issues, anxiety, depression, heart palpitations, etc., from this chronically elevated blood sugar, blood pressure, and insulin resistance, right? So what happens is people, in the pursuit of trying to gain muscle mass, they actually gain a lot of body fat, unwanted body fat. They're not really building muscle mass in the way that they want. People often refer to this as like a dirty bulk, right? So, people go through this yo-yoing effect. They're trying to lose weight, gain weight, lose weight, gain weight. So they're cutting their caloric intake to try to lose weight, but then they lose muscle because they're still insulin resistant. They don't like the way they look. They start increasing their food intake again. They gain the weight back, and up and down, up and down, up and down we go. Right. So basically, I'm saying all of that to say that the most efficient and sustainable way to build muscle mass is making sure that your glycogen storages inside your muscle tissue is full and that you're insulin sensitive by having a carbohydrate dominant diet. As far as muscle mass retention is concerned, because the thing is that in order to maximize muscle growth, we also need to maximize muscle retention. So basically, there's two states of being inside of a muscular environment. You have a catabolic environment and an anabolic environment. Catabolic is a word for muscle breakdown, right? A breakdown or deteriorating of the cells. Anabolic is a word for growth, right? So when you go into a caloric deficit or the glucose inside the muscle tissue is depleted, this puts the muscle in a catabolic state, this muscle breakdown. When the muscle is well fed, is well hydrated, and the glycogen stores inside the muscle tissue is full, it gets put into an anabolic state for muscle growth. When you maintain adequate levels of glycogen stored inside the muscle tissue, this maintains the actual muscle size and the muscle volume and strength. Right? So this is why I'm against carb cutting, right? Because the carbohydrates is needed to maintain the respiration and metabolic process that maintains the life cycle of the muscle tissue, right? So all of the cells inside the muscle tissue are living, and if you deprive them of that glucose, they die off sooner than later. They become dehydrated. They're not really able to feed off of the glucose, create intracellular energy, and they start to die off. And then as a result, you can experience weakening and muscle mass shrinkage and reduction. So this is why I prioritize the carbohydrates over the protein. Protein is important. It's just not as important as people think it is, as far as the overall amount you consume is concerned.
Yeah, actually, why do you think people tend to overestimate the importance of protein for building muscle? And why do people, when we say we're on a high raw vegan diet, often their first question, especially in the fitness world, is, well, you don't get enough protein?
Yeah, so basically, it's a cultural, kind of like a cultural pathology that we have. Is motivated by a couple things: tradition, as well as there's an economic incentive, right? So in the Western world, especially here in the United States, a large part of our food system is driven by animal agriculture. Really, our entire food system is built around animal agriculture, right? Chickens, cows, pigs, just basically having to slaughter billions of animals in the pursuit of protein. And so basically, there's a financial incentive to encourage the slaughter and consumption of animals and in order to facilitate this protein need.
And those farm
You're going to tell people
animals
to eat less.
also, I think they're more and more fat also now. They're not as protein as sometimes it's said it is, right?
Right, right, right. But yeah, so basically, it's an economic incentive. If you're telling people, hey, you don't need to eat as much protein, well, then, the ones who are selling protein and telling you to eat more, they take a financial loss as a result. They make less money, right? So media shapes our culture, right? We have this top down thing. So at the top we have wealthy economic interests, right? So for example, if you turn on your television, you never see advertisements for fruit, right? But back in the 90s you would see a got milk commercial, right? When you turn on the television, you see Arby's, you see Red
Mm.
Lobster, you see some any kind of steakhouse or whatever the case is, but there's always meat consumption being advertised to you, right? Even in junk food, they advertise how much protein is in the junk food, right? And there's no sugar, right? So they advertise there being no sugar and more protein, right? So basically, the interests that sell the protein, they work in collusion with the media to program the population to train them to believe that they need to pursue protein pretty aggressively, right? So they create media campaigns to indoctrinate the public to go out and eat more protein and eat more meat, and that drives sales and revenue and profit to the media centers and the big money interests that control the media. So a lot of the beliefs that we have, we basically inherited from the media. We've inherited our culture from the media, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of the things that people think is just a result of that. It's not based on science or anything like that.
Mm. So actually, that's quite interesting. Thank you for that. I would love to ask you, do you, so in my experience, in my opinion, what I'm feeling is that I'm also on a high raw vegan diet, as I've been for about 3 years. I'm very happy about it. I do wonder if it's the best way to build muscles, though. Where I'm at is it's the healthiest, I feel like it's the healthiest diet for me. And I feel maybe I'm not building muscle as fast as I could on another diet, but I want to build muscle, but I want to be healthy and have longevity that are more important. So for me, that's a bit my experience. But would you go as far as saying that the diet we're doing, high raw vegan, is even the best for building muscle and strength?
Yeah, so that's a good question, right? Um, because so basically, if somebody asked me, "Hey, what is the best way to build muscle mass?" My answer would be to maximize carbohydrate and protein consumption while doing steroids, right?
Yeah.
It's the best. It may not be the healthiest, but it'll build you muscle the fastest, right? However, building muscle mass and strength at a certain point, it will come into conflict with your health outcomes, right? So what you're doing is you're saying, well, I want to be as healthy as possible and have an ideal metabolism and live a longer, healthier life rather than just build muscle even at the expense of my health. So I don't know if I would say that like a raw or high raw vegan diet is the best for muscle building. I can make the argument that it is, right? But it depends on how you structure your diet, right? So there's a lot of different ways to structure a high raw vegan diet. the way that I do it, I think that it's very effective for building muscle. Is it the best ever? Possibly, maybe, right? I know it's very effective, at least for me and the people that I coach. So just being honest, where the answer is not necessarily as cut and dry, right? What I can tell you is that the fastest way to build muscle mass is getting, let's say, anywhere from 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of lean mass, and then eat carbohydrates and proteins at either a 3-to-1 or a 4-to-1 ratio. If you do that, generally speaking, that's going to be the best driver for muscle growth. Now, you can do that through a high raw vegan diet or any other means. I don't know, right? You can even do that on a fully raw diet, right? If you're using protein powders and things like that. So the answer is a bit more nuanced, right? I don't believe in magic bullets. There really aren't any magic bullets. We got to have a bit more of a nuanced conversation about these things. However, for me, I try to basically pursue the best fitness results, but not at the expense of health, right? So I don't really subscribe to gimmicks or any kind of magical thinking or just do this one thing and it's the best thing ever, right? I don't really feel comfortable saying that, right? So it's a bit more detailed. The last thing I'll say is your diet is the substrate for how much muscle you can build, right? So the better your diet is, the more likely you'll be able to build that muscle mass. However, your training is, I don't know if I would say it's more important, but your training strategy will make it or break your ability to build muscle, right? So people can have an ideal diet for building muscle mass, but their training is not ideal at all, right? And so basically, if you're not training efficiently to build muscle, then your results are going to be lacking, right? The primary driver of muscle growth when it comes to building muscle is going to be training intensity, right? You need a minimum threshold of training volume, and then you need training intensity, right? According to the scientific data, and I don't know how deep you want to get into hypertrophy training, but the basics of it is you have three categories in your training that dictate how you structure your training plan. Training frequency, how often you train. Volume, how much training, how many sets and reps you do. And then training intensity, how much resistance, how much force production or force you resist within a given workout, right? How hard you're pushing the muscle, right? So there's a balance between those things. Now, training frequency is important because the more you train a muscle or the more frequently you train a muscle, the more opportunity there is to engage in muscle protein synthesis of that particular muscle that you train. Muscle volume basically is extending the load or the duration of how much you train that muscle, how much stimulus you apply to that muscle. Training intensity also is a stimulus thing, right? So basically what you can do is, or what I would rather people do is dial back the volume and frequency and increase the intensity. The reason why I default to this is because a priority on recovery is more important than the training itself. So if you're very ambitious, you really want to build muscle, you're like, I'm going to train 5 days a week, 6 days a week. Sure, that's great for maximizing muscle volume, frequency, but it's not great for maximizing recovery. So if you're not recovering from your training and you're just running yourself into the ground, you may be working against yourself. You could be preventing yourself from gaining muscle mass or even causing yourself to lose muscle mass. If you were to scale back to, instead of training 5 or 6 days a week, maybe you scaled back to like 3 or 4, and that would improve your recovery and thus improve your results as far as building muscle, right? So according to the scientific literature, you need like around 3 to 6 sets a week to either build or maintain muscle mass. In order to really grow a muscle, right, you need more so a minimum of 10 sets per week or like 9 sets per week up to like 30 or maybe even above 30, right? I subscribe more so to a total collective volume of at least 30 sets per week, right? Of training volume if you really want to build muscle mass. So what that looks like is, let's say you train 3 days a week, but you do 10 working sets of training volume per workout, right? That's enough to build muscle mass. And it's enough to ensure adequate recovery in your training. Right? So then you have to factor in, okay, so how do you know that you're adequately building muscle, right? What's your goal? Is it to build 1 pound of muscle per month, 1.5, 2, or more? So if you don't have that number factored out, it's very difficult to say if you're gaining muscle real fast or slow, right? Because you have to define what the terms are. A good rate of muscle growth is like 1 pound to 1.5 pounds of lean mass per month. So within a calendar year, you can gain anywhere from, like, let's say 12 or 18 pounds of muscle mass within a year, excuse me, right? So, like, let's say you're 150 pounds and you said, okay, I'm going to take an entire calendar year or at least 9 months out of the year to try to maximize muscle hypertrophy. So I want to go from, let's say, 150 to 162 or even 165 by the end of the year. That's a good goal, right? And let's say your first year, you go from 150 to 162 or 165. That's a success. That is a successful year of muscle mass building. And that is enough to create a body transformation. It is very noticeable in the mirror. Your second year, you can build on top of that. So you can maintain at 162, 165. And then in your second year, you can close out that year at 170, 172, right? Or 175 in that second year. And then your third year, it could be like 178, 180, something like that. So every year, if you dedicate several years to muscle hypertrophy, I would say within 3 to 5 years, you can get really, really close to your genetic potential, right?
Amazing.
A collective total muscle gain would be somewhere around 24 pounds of muscle mass in your lifetime. You can gain about 24 pounds on average.
Amazing. And by the way, on this, I'm wondering, is it your experience that when people transition to a high raw vegan diet, they need first to kind of detox and shed a lot of weight and then almost rebuild muscles from scratch? Or do you manage to have that transition and still build muscle in that process?
Yeah, so it depends on where you're starting from. Let's say you're starting, but your body fat percentage is really high. Most people don't have much muscle mass on them, right? They may weigh a lot, but they don't have much muscle mass. So you can have a guy that guy could be 6 feet tall. He's 210 pounds, but he only has like 130 pounds of muscle mass on him. So he can drop down to 170 or 160 pounds and be like, oh man, I'm losing too much weight. It's like, I mean, not really. You don't have that much muscle mass on you. So basically, all that weight loss just shows what you really look like when you lean out at the lean mass that you currently are, right? So people overestimate what their true weight actually looks like. They think they're atrophying and losing a ton of muscle mass. That's not really what's happening. Right? So for example, like for me, my lean mass is like 145 pounds of lean mass is what I'm currently at. My total body weight is like 160, somewhere around there, right? So me, I'm 5'9". I have more muscle mass on me than most people who are over 6 feet tall. So just to give like a perspective there, right? So it's good to find out what your lean mass is and then calculate everything from that. Not your total body weight. Your total body weight is not that important. It's what your lean mass is. Your lean mass is your total weight minus your body fat percentage. Right? So For me, my measurements are like, let's say my waist is 30 inches. My shoulders are like 50. Right. And I'm like a 38 across the chest, something like that. Maybe 40, somewhere around there across the chest. So a good goal to shoot for would be like if you wanted to measure your circumference measurements. And then my hips are 40, 43, something like that, 44, somewhere around there. Maybe even more than that. I may be lowballing. I got to check. But essentially, a good goal for a man would be to have anywhere of a difference. Let's say if your waist is a 30 or a 32, your measurements across your chest can be like 10 plus inches over that, right? And you want to increase that ratio. So you'll have guys where their shoulders are like a 46 and their waist is like a 38. It's not a good body composition. So you want to really factor in your circumference measurements and your lean mass to really get a gauge of where you're really at. If you adopt a diet where you're eating enough and you're training adequately, then basically you will create that body transformation, that body recomposition to get to where you want to go. You just have to be patient with the process. It's not a thing that happens in a few months. If it's just going to be a thing that you pursue for a few months, you're not going to be successful. It takes several years. Right?
Thank you, thank you. Remson, that's the moment where I'd love to share a little bit about my coaching with an improvisation. Can you throw me a word, any word?
Well-being.
Well-being. So if you guys are passionate about well-being and anything really that makes the world better, well-being is one, freedom is another, building a conscious business is another, and you want to share that voice with the world, maybe you have a podcast in you. If that's the case, I would love to support you with that. So I will put a link in the description, and I'm currently giving free sessions one-on-one to people who want to start their own podcast and raise the consciousness through that. So you can check the link. And now we are back with our podcast. Remson, I'd love to ask you very quickly, how long have you been a high raw vegan? Because you said vegan 11 years, but high raw, how long has it been?
Like 3 or 4 years, something like that. I started like around 2020.
Cool. And a question I had when you were sharing about all this is, on paper, it seems amazing. And then when I look at the top athletes, whether it's top bodybuilders, so muscle mass, whether it's top strong men, whether it's also in terms of performance, like, I don't know, maybe UFC fighters or runners, or there's not a lot of them who would be high vegan, if any, really. Why is that?
Yes, the culture, right? Athletes do what their coaches tell them to do.
But if the high
Most
vegan
coaches,
is so superior, don't you feel like people would notice and then switch to that diet?
yeah, I mean, well, you have to be willing to do it, and you have to get the idea to do it, right? But if it's not within the confines of your culture, then not necessarily. So the culture is a limiting factor, right? If you have most coaches, let's say most prominent coaches who train like the world's greatest athletes are like in their 40s, maybe 50s, something like that. But they're pretty much, somewhere around their 40s or at least late 30s, right? So they've solidified their approach and their ideological disposition towards training and diet decades ago. So the whole high raw thing wasn't really a thing at that time, right? It's just not a prominent part of our culture. Things are starting to change now where you're having more like elite level vegan athletes, where they're plant-based athletes. And, a lot of the times they're outperforming their peers, right? There was actually a documentary done on this called Game Changers. And they did all types of scientific studies and measurements to calculate, blood oxygen, sleep quality, these types of things in plant-based athletes. And, a plant-based diet, like a high carb, whole food plant-based diet, and, in most cases outperforms a conventional style diet with animal products. But that's a relatively new development as far as the mainstream is concerned, right? There's a lot of things and a lot of methods that we use now that are not ideal, but we do it just because it's culture. Even if you think about our economic system, right? Our economic default is capitalism, right? And people assume capitalism is like the best economic system. It's not. There's not really any evidence that it is, but it's a general belief that people have, right? If you study economics and you realize that it's not, and you go through the ways that wealth is created and that type of thing, right? So, for example, in order for wealth to be generated, poverty also needs to be created on the other side, right? You can't have capitalism be successful without poverty.
Yeah, but I feel it's a little bit different. Just to share on that, is like with capitalism, it's almost like as a global system, it's not the best. But then, if you pursue your interest, you're actually generally better through capitalism. So, for example, if I destroy the environment to make money, it's not the best for the whole. But in my little selfish goal to make money, it's actually the best. Well,
Right.
in terms of the nutrition, if the high raw vegan would give me the best performance, then my selfish interest would also be to pursue that diet, right?
Well, the thing is, that's not really how it works because remember, what you eat is dictated by the wealthy, right?
Mm.
So let's say I'm a coach and I'm sponsored by various different animal agricultural businesses where
Mm.
they pay me to market their products. Am I really going to take a pay cut and drop those companies and the money they pay me to pursue a more plant-based approach?
Well, maybe
If I'm
because
trying to maximize my income and huh?
then then if I'm a coach and I'm using plant-based and my athletes do better, I will also have potentially more influence, right?
Maybe potentially, but the thing is that do you want to risk what you're currently making for a potential better
Mm.
outcome in the future? Maybe not,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
So there is some risk involved, right? So there's that thing where most people are not willing to risk the taking a pay cut, a steep pay cut, and lose endorsements and things like that. And then also, if you become adversarial to the big money interests that govern your sector of the economy, are they going to send the media after you? Are they going to have media outlets do hit pieces on you, right? Things like this. So these are the things that you have to consider, when we factor in our culture, right? And our cultural beliefs. A lot of them we don't even think to even challenge the beliefs we have.
Mm.
So what I'm saying about carbohydrates, that's based on scientific data, right? But culturally, we put this premium on protein, even though there's really not a science behind that. So an example of that is our population, at least here in the US and the Western world, our population is eating more and more protein and getting weaker and weaker and more unhealthy and unhealthy, right? So if you see an increase in animal product and protein consumption and then a decrease in strength, muscle mass, testosterone, and overall well-being, if the protein was that important and it produced the best results, we wouldn't be seeing that inverse correlation, right? However, there's going to be a lot of people who hear me say that and it never occurred to them. They didn't know. Right. So this is what I mean about like if you don't really hear certain conversations happening in public, that's why these podcasts are so important. So when you look at the most popular podcasts, like let's say the Joe Rogan podcast, right? He's sponsored by all types of animal product, beef sticks and meat sticks, that and all types of stuff, right? And all vegans and the soy and it's going to deplete your testosterone. You got to eat, bear burgers or whatever the case is, right? But, he's propped up and paid by various big money interests to say these things. It's just an economic interest. So he may be saying things that cut against the well-being of his audience, but that's his job. It's what he's paid to do. And this is not a critique of him as an individual. I'm basically making a systemic critique in how our culture is set up.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you so much, Remson. And actually, I'm looking forward to you training athletes that become world champion and become an embodiment of also this type of clean diet and how it can improve performance. Let's see.
I might have to be one of them.
Thank you so much. We're getting close to the end of this episode. And I'd love to ask you, is there anything else you'd love to share with our listener today?
Yeah, I think, I guess in a nutshell, what I would say is life for the most part is a zero-sum game, which means more of one thing is necessarily less of another, right? So we kind of have to diversify what we're pursuing and how we view life, right? So even if you're trying to build muscle, you'll build muscle, but just understand that the more you pursue the muscle growth, you're necessarily sacrificing something else. You have to be aware of what that is. In the same way, where if you're going to do a water fast and you're going to do a water fast for 14 days, you're going to be sacrificing something in the pursuit of that water fast, right? And a 14-day water fast is not exactly compatible with muscle growth, right? So you have to factor that into your calendar year where, you do a water fast, you lose a lot of weight. A portion of it will be lean mass. But the thing you gain from the water fast is the health benefits of doing it, right? So being clear on what you're gaining and what you're sacrificing, regardless of what you're pursuing, and just having a more nuance. A lot of throughout this entire conversation, we talked a lot about nuance, right? So you always want to be aware of the nuances in your internal dialogue, the things that you're pursuing in your life, etc., right? And just practice and cultivate that self-awareness.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Remson. Thank you for all the knowledge you've been sharing here and the new paradigm that you're embodying and sharing with people. So if anyone has questions or comments, you can put down the video. And thank you, Remson, and thank you to everyone who listened to this.